Walter Jefferson leaned on his old wooden cane, the rough, weathered grain pressing into his palm as he surveyed his land. The morning sun cast long shadows across the fields, the dew on the grass catching the light like scattered diamonds. This land had been his family's for 3 generations, a small but cherished piece of American soil that his father had bought with the sweat of his brow and the calluses on his hands. Walter had served his country, done his part, and returned to this quiet corner of the world to find peace in his old age. But peace was a fragile thing, easily shattered. The distant sound of gravel crunching under tires pulled Walter from his thoughts. He straightened, squinting into the morning haze as 2 police cruisers rumbled down the long dirt driveway, their white and blue lights reflecting off the cracked, sun-bleached hood of his old pickup. He tightened his grip on his cane, his mind already racing through the possibilities. He hadn't called for help, and his nearest neighbor, old Mrs. Harper, usually only waved from her porch, too frail to come down the hill these days. The cruisers rolled to a stop in front of his house, the engines idling loudly as the doors swung open. Officers Jake Harper and Mike Collins stepped out, their mirrored sunglasses reflecting the bright morning light, their boots crunching against the gravel as they approached. Harper, the taller of the two, rested his hand casually on the butt of his service pistol, his thumbs hooked into his belt, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face as he locked eyes with Walter. "Morning, old man," Harper called, his tone mocking as he swaggered up the driveway. "We got a call about some suspicious activity out here. Thought we'd stop by and make sure everything's in order." Walter felt a flicker of anger, but he forced himself to remain calm, leaning heavily on his cane as he met the younger man's gaze. "This is my land," he said, his deep, gravelly voice steady despite the rising heat in his chest. "Been mine for over 40 years. Ain't no suspicious activity here, just an old man minding his own business." Collins snorted, adjusting his sunglasses as he glanced around the yard, his eyes lingering on the small vegetable garden near the front porch and the neatly stacked firewood by the side of the house. "Funny," he said, stepping closer, his boots leaving deep prints in the loose gravel. "Because we got a call saying someone was trespassing out here. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" Walter's jaw tightened, his grip on the cane growing white-knuckled. "I'm not trespassing," he said, his voice growing firmer. "I own this land. Got the deed hanging on the wall inside if you'd care to take a look." Harper chuckled, glancing back at his partner, who smirked in response. "Deed or no deed, we're here to investigate," Harper said, his tone sharp as he stepped closer, his shadow falling across the small, hand-built memorial Walter had set up near the edge of the yard. Walter had spent hours building that memorial, a simple, wooden cross with a row of polished brass plaques bearing the names of his fallen brothers, men he had served with, men he had lost. Photos of his old unit, their young faces forever frozen in black and white, framed the base, alongside a few carefully folded American flags. Harper paused, glancing down at the small memorial, his smirk widening as he reached down, his gloved hand closing around one of the photos. He held it up, the sunlight catching on the glass, the smiling faces of Walter's brothers reflected in the dark lenses of his sunglasses. "Nice little setup you got here," Harper said, his tone dripping with mock admiration. "Shame it's about to get a little messy." Before Walter could react, Harper dropped the photo, letting it fall face down into the dirt. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he lifted his boot and stepped down, the glass cracking loudly beneath his heel, the shards grinding into the soil as he twisted his foot, his smirk never wavering. Walter felt a surge of rage flare in his chest, his breath catching in his throat as he took a half-step forward, his cane digging into the gravel as his pulse pounded in his ears. You get your foot off that, boy," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "You have no right." Collins stepped up beside his partner, his lips curling into a sneer as he nudged one of the folded flags with the toe of his boot, sending it tumbling down the small hill toward the front porch. "Looks like we got ourselves a real patriot here," Collins said, his tone mocking as he crossed his arms over his chest. "Maybe you ought to learn a little respect for the law, old man." Walter's fists tightened, his shoulders squared as he forced himself to stay calm, his mind racing through the countless confrontations he had survived in his younger years, the countless times he had stared down men like this and refused to back down. "This is my land," he said again, his voice steady, his eyes locked on Harper's. "My home. You don't get to come here and tear it up, not without a damn good reason." Harper leaned in close, his breath hot against Walter's ear, his voice a low, menacing whisper. "We're the law around here," he said, his tone dripping with contempt. "And as far as I'm concerned, you're trespassing." Walter's heart raced, his mind flashing through the years of service, the battles fought, the brothers lost. He had faced down enemy fire, walked through minefields, and carried his wounded friends to safety. He had earned this land, earned his peace, and he wasn't about to let a couple of smug, power-hungry cops take it from him. As the two officers turned to leave, Harper reached down, his hand closing around the small wooden cross that marked the center of Walter's memorial. With a sharp, brutal twist, he ripped it from the ground, tossing it into the dirt like a piece of trash, his laughter echoing off the trees as he strode back to the cruiser. Walter stood frozen, his fists trembling, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts as he watched the dust settle around the shattered remnants of his brother's memorial. He had fought too hard, bled too much, and lost too many to let this stand. Walter Jefferson stood in the middle of his yard, his heart still pounding from the rage that had gripped him as he watched Officer Harper grind his fallen brother's memorial into the dirt. The shattered glass and crumpled photos lay scattered at his feet, a silent testament to the disrespect that had just been shown to the men he had once called brothers. Walter felt his chest tighten, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts as he tried to calm himself. The two officers had retreated to their cruisers, leaning against the hoods, their arms crossed, their smug smirks still firmly in place. Harper reached up, adjusting his mirrored sunglasses as he watched Walter with a look of pure contempt. "Got a problem, old man?" Harper called, his tone dripping with mockery. "You look a little upset. Maybe you should sit down before you hurt yourself." Walter clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white as he struggled to keep his temper in check. He had faced worse than this in his lifetime, seen men die, carried the wounded off the battlefield, and returned to a country that had often been less than welcoming to veterans like him. But this was his land, his home, and he wasn't about to let a couple of thugs in uniform take it from him. "Get off my property," Walter said, his voice low and steady, each word carefully measured, like the slow, deliberate pull of a trigger. "You've got no right to be here." Harper's smirk widened, his head tilting to one side as he pushed off the hood of his cruiser, his boots crunching against the gravel as he approached. "Oh, I think we've got every right," he said, his tone still mocking, but with a sharper edge now, a hint of real menace creeping into his voice. "You see, you just threatened a law enforcement officer. That's a serious offense, old man." Walter felt a cold chill run down his spine, the warning bells in his mind clanging loudly as Harper closed the distance between them, his eyes hidden behind the dark, reflective lenses of his sunglasses. "I didn't threaten you," Walter said, his voice firm, his jaw set. "I told you to leave. This is my land." Harper's hand shot out, grabbing the front of Walter's faded, sweat-stained t-shirt, twisting the fabric in his fist as he leaned in close, his breath hot and bitter against Walter's face. "Now you're resisting," Harper hissed, his tone dripping with false indignation. "That's another charge." Before Walter could react, Collins appeared at his side, grabbing his arm and yanking it roughly behind his back, the old tendons in his shoulder popping painfully as his wrist was twisted into an unnatural angle. "What are you doing?" Walter gasped, the sudden surge of pain forcing a sharp breath from his lungs. "I didn't do anything." Harper leaned in closer, his teeth bared in a predatory grin as he tightened his grip on Walter's shirt, the fabric cutting into his chest. "You're under arrest," he said, his tone low and mocking, "for resisting a lawful order and assaulting an officer." Walter felt the cold steel of the handcuffs snap around his wrists, the metal biting into his skin as Collins twisted his arms behind his back, forcing his shoulders into an agonizing position. He felt his knees buckle slightly, the pain radiating through his arms and chest, but he refused to cry out, refused to give them the satisfaction. "You're making a mistake," Walter said, his voice tight with pain but still steady, his eyes locked on Harper's shadowed face. "I didn't resist. I didn't touch you." Harper chuckled, his grip tightening as he leaned in even closer, his lips mere inches from Walter's ear. "That's not how I remember it," he whispered, his tone dripping with sadistic amusement. "And trust me, when we write up the report, it'll say whatever we want it to say." They shoved Walter toward the cruiser, his boots scraping against the gravel as they forced him to walk with his arms pinned painfully behind his back. The hot metal of the hood burned against his chest as they slammed him against the car, Collins' heavy hand pressing down on the back of his neck, forcing his face against the hot, sun-warmed metal. Walter felt his pulse racing, his mind flashing back to the countless patrols he had walked, the endless days and nights of combat, the brothers he had lost, the promises he had made to himself that he would never again be a prisoner, never again be at the mercy of men who abused their power. As they forced him into the back of the cruiser, Collins leaned in close, his breath hot and foul against Walter's ear. "You keep causing trouble," he whispered, his tone low and menacing. "And maybe we'll have to pay a visit to that grandson of yours, just to make sure everything's okay at his school. Wouldn't want anything bad to happen, right?" Walter felt his heart skip a beat, his blood turning to ice in his veins as the full weight of the threat sank in. They weren't just coming after him. They were threatening his family now, his flesh and blood, the only thing he had left in this world. He felt his fists clench, his wrists straining against the cold steel of the cuffs as a surge of pure, unfiltered rage flooded his system. They had crossed a line he could not, would not, ignore. As the cruiser pulled away from the house, the gravel crunching under the tires like bones snapping beneath a boot, Walter forced himself to take a slow, deep breath, his eyes closing as he whispered a silent promise to himself. This wasn't over. Walter Jefferson sat on the cold, hard bench in the small holding cell at the county jail, his wrists still aching from the too tight handcuffs that had been slapped on him hours earlier. The air in the cell was stale, tinged with the faint scent of bleach and despair. The walls, painted a dull, institutional gray, seemed to close in on him, the heavy metal bars casting long, thin shadows across the concrete floor as the overhead fluorescent lights buzzed softly. He leaned back, resting his head against the cool concrete wall, his mind racing with the events of the morning. The unjust arrest, the brutal treatment, the twisted, mocking smiles of the officers as they had shoved him into the back of the cruiser, it all replayed in his mind, each memory stoking the fire of his anger. He thought of his land, the small piece of freedom he had carved out for himself after years of service, the memorial he had built for his fallen brothers, the small vegetable garden he had planted in his late wife's memory. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his calloused palms as he imagined those two officers prowling around his property, their boots grinding his memories into the dirt. Outside the cell, the harsh, metallic clank of keys echoed through the narrow hallway, followed by the heavy, deliberate footsteps of a guard making his rounds. Walter straightened, his jaw tightening as he watched the man pass by without so much as a glance in his direction. He felt the bitter taste of rage rise in his throat, a dark, simmering fury that had been building since the moment those two thugs had set foot on his land. Meanwhile, miles away, Harper and Collins had not forgotten about Walter's property. In fact, they had made a point to return, their patrol car rumbling down the long dirt driveway as they pulled up in front of his small, modest house. They stepped out, the gravel crunching beneath their boots as they made their way toward the small flagpole Walter had installed near his front porch, the American flag flapping gently in the warm afternoon breeze. Harper glanced up at the flag, his lips curling into a sneer as he reached up, grabbing the rope and yanking it down with a sharp, deliberate pull. The flag fluttered down, the fabric snapping in the wind as he ripped it from the pole, letting it fall into the dirt at his feet. Collins snorted, nudging the flag with the toe of his boot, grinding it into the gravel as he chuckled. "Look at this," he said, his tone dripping with contempt. "Old man thinks he's some kind of hero, like his time overseas means anything to us." Harper leaned down, scooping up the now dusty flag and tossing it onto the hood of Walter's old pickup, the fabric sliding across the sun-warmed metal before coming to rest in a crumpled heap near the windshield. He turned, his eyes narrowing as he spotted the small vegetable garden near the side of the house, the neat rows of tomato plants, green beans, and peppers carefully tended and thriving in the rich, dark soil. With a twisted grin, Harper stepped over to the garden, reaching down and grabbing a handful of the tall, green bean plants, yanking them up by the roots, the soil clinging to the tangled, torn tendrils as he tossed them aside. Collins joined him, kicking over a row of tomato plants, the small, bright red fruits bursting under his boots, their juices splattering across the freshly tilled soil. "Yes, he won't be needing this anymore," Harper said, his voice dripping with cruel satisfaction as he ripped up another plant, the thick, green leaves crumpling in his fist. "Not after today." They moved through the garden like a pair of wild animals, tearing up plants, scattering the carefully arranged stones that marked the rows, kicking over the small, weathered wooden stakes that held up the heavier vines. Within minutes, the once thriving garden had been reduced to a tangled mess of broken stems, crushed vegetables, and scattered dirt, the small, hand-painted sign that read, Helen's Garden, lying face down in the mud. Back in town, the officers weren't content to simply destroy Walter's physical legacy. They wanted to break his spirit as well. They made their rounds through the quiet, tree-lined streets, stopping to chat with neighbors, spreading whispered rumors and half-truths about the crazy old man who had lost his mind and attacked the police. They painted Walter as a dangerous, unpredictable figure, a man who had become unhinged in his old age, a threat to the peace and safety of the community. They hinted that perhaps it was time for the old soldier to move on, to sell his land and leave the neighborhood to people who knew how to follow the rules. It didn't take long for the rumors to spread. By the time Walter was released from custody later that evening, the damage had already been done. His once friendly neighbors now avoided his eyes as he passed, their smiles replaced by wary glances and hurried whispers. The children who used to wave as he sat on his front porch now crossed the street to avoid his house, their parents pulling them along with nervous, hurried steps. As Walter pulled into his driveway, his heart sank at the sight of his ruined garden, the crumpled flag still lying in a dusty heap on the hood of his truck, the small wooden stakes scattered like broken bones across the yard. He stepped out of his truck, his boots crunching against the gravel as he took in the destruction, his jaw tightening, his fist clenching at his sides as a low, guttural growl rose in his throat. They had crossed a line. They had torn down the flag he had raised every morning in honor of his fallen brothers, ripped up the garden he had planted in memory of his beloved wife, and turned his neighbors against him with their lies and manipulation. Walter felt his pulse quicken, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts as he surveyed the damage, his mind racing with thoughts of revenge, of justice, of the long, hard years he had spent defending the very freedoms these men had just trampled under their boots. Walter Jefferson sat on his front porch, the cool evening air brushing against his weathered face as he looked out over the ruins of his once thriving garden. The small, hand-painted sign that had read, Helen's Garden, lay broken in the dirt, the shattered remnants of the plants he had so carefully tended scattered across the yard like fallen soldiers on a battlefield. The American flag he had raised every morning in honor of his fallen brothers still lay crumpled on the hood of his truck, its fabric dirt-stained and wrinkled. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped together as he tried to push back the rage that had been simmering in his chest since the moment the officers had driven him away in handcuffs. The memories of their mocking laughter, the way they had twisted his arms behind his back, the threats they had whispered about his grandson, it all replayed in his mind, each image stoking the fire that burned in his gut. The gravel at the end of the long, dirt driveway crunched loudly, the sound cutting through the quiet evening air like a gunshot. Walter straightened, his eyes narrowing as he spotted the unmistakable glow of red and blue lights reflecting off the trees that lined the road. Two police cruisers pulled into his driveway, their engines rumbling loudly as the officers stepped out, their boots hitting the ground with a deliberate, menacing weight. Harper adjusted his sunglasses, his smirk already spreading across his face as he approached the front porch, his partner, Collins, close behind, his fingers tapping lightly against the handle of his baton as they closed the distance. "Evening, old man," Harper called, his tone dripping with mock politeness. "We thought we'd stop by and check on you. Make sure you're settling back in all right." Walter felt his fist clench, his knuckles turning white as he forced himself to remain seated, his eyes locked on the two men as they sauntered up the steps, their boots creaking against the weathered wood. Collins leaned against the porch railing, his eyes scanning the ruined garden, the scattered flag, the broken memorial. "Looks like you've had a rough few days," he said, his tone as cold and sharp as a blade. "Shame about that garden." Walter felt his jaw tighten, the muscles in his neck straining as he fought to keep his composure. He knew what they were doing, pushing him, trying to break him, to force him into a reaction they could use as an excuse to drag him back to jail. Harper stepped closer, his shadow falling across Walter's legs as he leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, mocking whisper. "You know," he said, his breath hot and bitter against Walter's ear, "we've been thinking about taking another look at your file. Maybe we missed something the first time. Maybe there's a reason you don't seem to respect the law." Walter's heart pounded in his chest, his pulse thundering in his ears as he forced himself to meet Harper's eyes, his gaze hard and unflinching. "I've respected the law my whole life," he growled, his voice low and steady. "It's men like you that don't." Harper straightened, his smirk fading slightly as he took a step back, his hand hovering near his gun as he sized Walter up, his eyes narrowing behind his mirrored sunglasses. But before he could respond, the deep, throaty rumble of a powerful engine echoed down the driveway, the gravel crunching loudly as a sleek, black SUV rolled into view. The vehicle came to a slow stop behind the cruisers, the engine still growling as the driver's side door swung open. A tall, muscular figure stepped out, his boots hitting the gravel with a quiet, measured confidence. He straightened, removing his sunglasses with a casual, fluid motion as he took in the scene before him. The two officers on the porch, his father sitting in his battered old rocking chair, the ruined garden, the broken flag. It was Marcus Jefferson, Walter's only son, and a former Navy SEAL. Marcus closed the door with a soft, deliberate click, his eyes never leaving the two officers as he stepped around the front of the SUV, his jaws set, his broad shoulders squared, his movement slow and controlled, like a predator sizing up his prey. Harper and Collins exchanged a quick glance, their smirks faltering as they took in the man standing before them, the hard lines of his face, the sharp, calculating eyes, the way he carried himself with a quiet, coiled strength that spoke of years of training, of battles fought and won. Marcus stopped at the foot of the porch steps, his hands slipping casually into the pockets of his leather jacket as he looked up at the two officers, his lips curving into a small, dangerous smile. "Is there a problem here, gentlemen?" he asked, his tone calm, almost friendly, but with an unmistakable edge that cut through the tension like a knife. Harper's smirk returned, though it lacked its usual confidence, his eyes flicking nervously between Marcus and Walter. "Who are you?" he demanded, his hand tightening on his gun. Marcus took a slow step forward, his boots creaking against the old wooden steps as he reached into his jacket, pulling out a small, black leather wallet. He flipped it open, revealing his military ID, the small, silver seal trident gleaming in the harsh porch light. "Marcus Jefferson," he said, his voice steady, his eyes locked on Harper's. "Former SEAL team commander, decorated combat veteran, and the son of the man you just tried to put in a cage." Harper's jaw tightened, his fingers twitching slightly as he took a small, involuntary step back, his confidence crumbling in the face of the decorated warrior standing before him. Collins swallowed, his hand dropping away from his baton as he took a half step back, his eyes wide as he took in the small, polished badge pinned to the inside of Marcus's wallet, the list of combat awards and commendations engraved beneath his name. Marcus took another step forward, his eyes never leaving the two officers as he slipped his ID back into his jacket, his jaw set, his fists clenched at his sides. "You want to play tough," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "You want to push around an old man, tear up his garden, rip down his flag? Fine. But understand this, you just crossed a line you can't come back from." The silence that followed was thick and heavy, the two officers frozen in place, their eyes wide, their faces pale as the full weight of Marcus's words sank in. Marcus Jefferson stood on the creaking wooden steps of his father's porch, his sharp eyes locked onto the two officers in front of him. The cool evening air hung heavy with the scent of freshly turned soil and the faint, metallic tang of his father's old pickup truck. Harper and Collins had frozen in place, their faces pale, their hands twitching nervously as Marcus slowly slipped his military ID back into the pocket of his leather jacket. For a moment, the only sound was the quiet rustle of the trees lining the driveway, their branches swaying gently in the breeze as if the entire forest were holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Marcus took another step forward, his boots thudding softly against the weathered wood as he crossed the threshold, his broad shoulders blocking the dim light from the doorway behind him. He could feel the heat of his father's gaze on his back, the quiet, unspoken pride and anger that radiated from the old man like a physical force. "You boys seem a little nervous," Marcus said, his voice low and steady, each word carefully measured, like the slow, deliberate click of a rifle bolt being locked into place. "Something wrong?" Harper's jaw tightened, his fingers twitching at his side as he struggled to regain his composure, his mirrored sunglasses reflecting Marcus's hard, unflinching stare. "We're just doing our job," he said, his voice strained, his eyes darting to Collins, who had taken a small, stumbling step backward, his hand dropping away from his baton. Marcus's lips curled into a small, dangerous smile as he took another slow step down the stairs, his boots crunching against the gravel as he reached the bottom. "Your job," he repeated, his tone sharp, each word cutting through the tense silence like a knife. "You call this your job? Harassing an old man, tearing up his garden, ripping down his flag, threatening his family?" Harper's face flushed a deep, angry red, his fist clenching at his sides as he took a small, defiant step forward, his chest puffed out like a cornered animal. "Watch yourself," he growled, his voice low and threatening. "You might be a big shot soldier, but out here, you're just another civilian." Marcus's smile widened, his eyes narrowing as he reached into his jacket again, pulling out his cell phone. He tapped the screen a few times, his thumb moving quickly over the glass as he brought the device to his ear, his eyes never leaving Harper's pale, sweating face. "Hey," he said, his tone calm, almost casual, as the line clicked to life. "Yeah, it's me. I need a favor. Got a couple of problems out here I need some help with." Harper's eyes widened slightly, his jaw clenching as Marcus slipped the phone back into his pocket, his eyes cold and unblinking as he took another slow step forward, his tall frame casting a long, menacing shadow across the gravel driveway. For a long, tense moment, no one spoke, the air thick with unspoken threats and the faint, distant rustle of the wind through the trees. Then, from somewhere down the road, the low, throaty rumble of engines shattered the silence, the gravel crunching loudly as a line of sleek, black SUVs rolled into view, their headlights cutting through the twilight like the eyes of a pack of wolves. The vehicles pulled to a slow stop behind Marcus's SUV, their doors swinging open in perfect unison as a small group of tall, muscular men stepped out, their movements sharp and precise, their faces hard and unreadable. They spread out behind Marcus, forming a silent, disciplined line, their eyes locked on the two officers, their arms crossed over their broad chests as they stood in perfect formation, their boots crunching softly against the gravel as they closed ranks behind their former commander. Harper took a small, involuntary step back, his face pale, his mouth working silently as he struggled to process the sudden, overwhelming shift in power. Collins's hands trembled at his sides, his eyes darting nervously between the silent, imposing figures that now filled the driveway, their sharp, unblinking eyes fixed on the two officers like a pair of predators sizing up their prey. Marcus took another slow step forward, his eyes narrowing as he locked his gaze on Harper, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "You boys made a mistake," he said, his tone cold, his jaw set. "You crossed a line you can't come back from." Harper swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously as he took another small step back, his boots slipping slightly on the loose gravel as he felt the full weight of Marcus's icy stare. "Look," he stammered, his voice shaky, his hands raised in a weak, defensive gesture. We were just doing our job. We didn't mean anything by it." Marcus's smile widened, his eyes flashing with a cold, dangerous light as he took another slow, deliberate step forward, his boots crunching against the gravel as the men behind him closed ranks, their broad shoulders forming a solid, unbreakable wall of muscle and resolve. "Your job," Marcus repeated, his voice dripping with contempt. "Your job is to protect and serve, not terrorize and intimidate. You crossed a line, and now you're going to pay for it." From behind him, one of the men, a tall, broad-shouldered figure with a thick, black beard and a scar running down the side of his face, stepped forward, his boots thudding softly against the gravel as he placed a heavy hand on Marcus's shoulder, his eyes never leaving the two trembling officers. "We've got this," the man said, his voice low and steady, each word a quiet, unspoken promise of retribution. As the officers stumbled back toward their cruisers, their faces pale, their hands shaking, the men slowly closed ranks, their eyes cold and unblinking as they watched the two men retreat, their shoulders hunched, their boots slipping on the loose gravel as they scrambled to escape the silent, unbreakable wall of seals now blocking their path. Within hours, the entire confrontation, captured by the security cameras Walter had installed around his property, went viral, the footage spreading across social media like wildfire. The officers' faces splashed across every news channel in the country as symbols of corruption and abuse. Harper and Collins were fired within days, their badges stripped, their careers in ruins as federal charges for harassment, intimidation, and abuse of power loomed on the horizon. Walter's land was restored, his flag raised once more, his small vegetable garden replanted in his late wife's memory. He became a local hero, his story inspiring a wave of support for veterans across the country, his name spoken with respect and admiration by those who had once turned their backs on him.